Hi, today I'm going to look at the game between Carlsen and Nakamura. Again, this game was played at AI Cup 2023. There was there were also other games that we looked at from this tournament between these players, and now it's turn for another game. Carlsen playing white. Starts with knight f3, knight f6, c4, b6. This opening order is this opening move with playing b6 is a bit unusual. More common move is to play c5, but b6 is also okay and also should be a good move. g3, bishop b7. What Carlsen wants to do is he wants to create an opponent to black bishop b7. Instead of playing g3, he could have played d4, bishop b7, e3, e6, something like that. But then the problem, kind of, it's not a problem, but just this bishop doesn't have a strong opponent on g2 like he does in the game. If white can play, if white can play e4 and then d5 to lock this bishop off the game, it would be great for white. But black shouldn't be allowing that. Maybe knight e4, queen c2, f5, d5, something like this. Okay, so Carlsen answers with g3, bishop b7, bishop g2, e6, castle, bishop e7. Both sides, Carlsen and Nakamura, are developing the pieces. Nakamura is going to castle, short side, then play c5, d5 maybe, and Carlsen is going to play, I guess Carlsen is going to play d4, d4, knight c3, maybe d5, maybe this is a move to look for, to watch out for. Or maybe he's going to play b3, bishop b2, but I think that to play d4, knight c3 is a more natural way, and it's going to be either like Catalan opening if Nakamura decides to play d5, which would resemble Catalan opening, or it would be like Queen Indian defense with somehow this all resembles Catalan Queen's Indian with development of the bishop to g2 is they are similar. Somehow there are common traits in them that both of them have this bishop on g2. Knight c3, castle. d5 also was playable, I guess. d5, d4, or knight e5, knight d7, d4, knight e5, d take e5, knight d7, c take d5, knight e5, maybe just something like this. Queen d1, capture on f7, capture with the king, capture with the rook. No. So I checked out a variation that led to black being without a pawn, and it's bad. Bad for black. But it doesn't mean that move d5 is bad or something. So I made a lot of moves which were not all of them were perfect, so to say. Okay, so castle, rook e1, move from Magnus Carlsen. So Magnus decides not to go for d4. He decides not to play d4. If he played d4 now, I guess he didn't like knight e4. Knight e4, and for example d5, knight. I guess that d5 is creating weaknesses. For example, d5, knight c3, b takes, bishop f6, and it looks good for black. And knight e4, maybe like there is this jump of a knight to e4, then f5 is going to follow. Maybe d5. No, d5 we already checked it out. Maybe knight d2, knight c3, b takes c3, bishop g2, king g2, d5, something like this. So Carlsen goes for move rook e1. Unexpected move for me. And this move has a clear idea of playing e4, and then knight f6 cannot jump to e4, and it controls the d5 square. So how black should react? Maybe d5, maybe c5, maybe knight e4, maybe d6. But d5 seems kind of d5, knight e5, seems knight d7, knight d4, maybe knight e5, capture, capture, knight e4, capture, capture, queen c2. Maybe black is no, queen d4. So okay, so it essentially it seems to me that after rook e1, so d5, I would go for d5, and d5 was actually played in the game, and Nakamura played d5. d5, now it's Magnus' turn. Knight e5 is a bit stupidly looking because white has the pieces on the queen side undeveloped, and to make moves with a piece 2 times in an opening is not a thing that is recommended. However, I still would consider this move, knight e5. Since if white now plays d4, then there is a capture on c4, and it's not very clear how if there is a reason for this sacrifice. If white captures, so white wants to develop the pieces, but at the same time white has to react because now there is a threat of capture of the pawn c. So maybe white can take on d5, c takes d5, e takes d5, then d4, or c takes d5, knight d5, then d4. Also makes sense, since knight e5 doesn't kind of make a lot of sense in terms that it loses time. So maybe c takes d4, e takes d4, d4, maybe. C takes d5, c takes d5 was played by Magnus Carlsen. So now Nakamura has to think, should he be capturing on d5? A capture on d5 is a must. Should he be capturing on d5 with a knight or with a pawn? With a bishop, I don't really think it's worth serious consideration, since bishop d5, knight going to capture this bishop on d5, and white squared bishop is very important in this position, especially considering that white has a powerful white squared bishop on g2. So it's either e d5 or knight d5, and both I think are possible, but maybe a capture with a pawn is kind of more like it, since knight d5, then e4 is going to follow. E4 is going to follow, and there is a good chance that white will actually grab the center with after playing e4, white will play d4 and grab the center. So e takes d5. No, Okay, Nakamura goes for knight d5. e4 is played in the game. Carlsen goes for the center, and if knight c3, I don't even kind of doesn't look great, since knight c3, b takes c3, and white is going to have a powerful center. So knight better to maybe play knight b4, d4, knight b4 with the threat of playing knight d3, which is a relatively serious threat. And but knight b4, d4, c5. Okay, Nakamura actually decides to capture on c3, which looks weird. B takes c3, c5, d4, capture on c takes d4, c takes d4. So Nakamura now has to decide what to do. He has to finish the development of the pieces on the queen side and get his rook a to the center. And a way to do this would be to play knight c6 and then to play knight a5. Maybe knight c6, d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, knight a5. And the pawn d5 is powerful, but there is already probably no way to stop this pawn from marching forward other than to play bishop f6. Then maybe rook b1, and still the pawn, the bishop f6, rook b1. So knight c6, d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, knight a5. There is a double attack. Bishop a3, rook e8, rook e8. Oh, knight c6, I guess. Knight c6 was played in the game. This is the game. So, okay, let's take a look at this position that Magnus has now on board. It's Magnus Carlsen turn, and he has pretty solid, pretty good position. Center is very strong, and naturally the move that anyone would want to make is d5. d5, e takes d5, e takes d5, knight b4, bishop a3, and knight d5, bishop e7, knight e7, queen d8, rook f d8, rook e7. So it doesn't look like a good variation. d5 seems like a solid option, but some risk. Okay, so d5, it takes d5, it takes d5, knight b4, bishop a3, a5. There is a problem that this powerful pawn d might get lost after push d5. So it would be amazing, but there is a risk for this pawn to get lost. Maybe there are other moves than d5. Maybe bishop e3 or bishop f4. Bishop f4 also there is an interesting move. There are moves like this. Bishop f4. Oh, it's not very clear to me how to proceed. Several moves are worth consideration. d5, bishop f4, bishop e3. Let's see. Magnus plays bishop b2. Bishop b2. Okay. Black has to play probably rook c8. No, knight a5, because okay, knight a5, rook c1, rook c8, queen d3, queen d7, d5, rook c1, rook c1, capture on d5, knight e5, queen a4. Okay, so white now can play rook c7, and white can play e takes d5. To me, e takes d5 seems great. I would go for e takes d5, which Magnus did. Queen a2, queen c3. A lot of threats. Now there is a threat to checkmate with an x-ray, and like to play something like knight d7, and if rook goes away to e8, then to capture on g7 with a checkmate. Bishop f6 is played in the game. Rook a1, queen b3. Oh, maybe white should go for something like queen b3, knight b3, rook a7, knight c5 seems pretty amazing. Oh, it seems like white is on the verge of winning the game. Knight d7, maybe. Bishop b2, knight c5, bishop d5, knight d7, rook a1, a8. No, rook a8 is not a good option. Okay, it seems like if the variant is correct, which I'm not at all sure, it seems like win is win. Okay, rook queen b3. Actually, in the game, Magnus proceeds with knight b3, rook a7, knight c5, and now he plays f4. And I considered move an interesting, I don't know, like a move knight d7. Knight d7, which seems also like it hangs a piece, but it hangs both pieces. This move is amazing if it's okay. This move is amazing if it's good, but if it's not, it's not amazing. So if bishop b2, then knight c5. If bishop d5, then knight d7. And this is the kind of position that, wow, this is the kind of position that is going to get white to get. So knight d7. If bishop b2, then knight c5. Maybe capture on c5, capture on d5. And maybe black just blocks the pawn. If black is able to block the pawn, then white gets nothing out of this. And there is an option to block the pawn. Knight c5, knight bishop no, so b takes c5, rook b7, and bishop e5, and blacks block the pawn, so it's not as dangerous. This move knight d7 is maybe it's not as dangerous. Bishop b2, and if instead black plays knight d7, then rook b7. This position is interesting, and white can play d6 and have an advantage. so after knight d7, black should go for blocking, for the block to capture bishop b2 or b7, to capture knight d7, bishop b2, knight c5, b takes c, and now rook takes on b, and bishop e7, e5 seems the best. And black blocks this. Well, maybe blocks and maybe doesn't block it. But okay, the advantage of white isn't that great here. c4, if it exists at all. Maybe there is no advantage. Okay, so f4, Magnus plays f4. There is pawn d5, a lot of moves, kind of. Okay, white f4 is a great move. White has a great advantage. For example, like rook a8, bishop a8, d6, bishop g2, king g2, king f8, bishop a3. Okay, so rook a7, knight c5, f4, Magnus played f4. Now Nakamura plays rook a8, like I suggested. Rook takes a8, bishop a8, king f2 is played. But okay, so instead of playing d6, which is probably not as good, Magnus strengthens his pieces. He takes his king closer to the center, like is advisable in the endgame. Bishop a8, king f2, king f8, king e3, king e8, bishop a3, bishop e7, knight c4, b5, knight e5, bishop b7, knight c6, bishop c6, d takes c6, knight a6. So if now white makes a stupid move like this, then white might get to a position which is worse. Which is worse if now black manages to capture this pawn c6, which is well defended, which is defended only with the bishop and might be well attacked. And if black captures this pawn, that black might get an advantage. And it's difficult to do anything now, since it's difficult to do anything. It already might be difficult for white, difficult position. So of course, at this position, it's much better to play bishop b2, like was played in the game. Bishop b2 was played then to exchange the bishops and to essentially to allow black to get his king to d6 and then to attack freely the pawn c6 with a king and a knight, and then capture the pawn. And instead of having a bad position, black is would get a good position. So bishop b2 was played, and it's it's a better solution than exchanging on e7. f6. Now king e4. Carlsen creates a threat of penetrating black's position of playing king f5, king e6, and it might be serious. Maybe not this exact move order, but he would want this. He would want black to play g6 and to create additional weaknesses. Bishop d6 is played. Maybe king h4 is played, king e7, h5, g6, h6. This is also interesting that h6 is an a good move, because if at some point later white captures on g6 with the bishop, it's after capture on g6 with 8 takes g6, white pawn h is going to promote, so it's always a headache for black to have. King e6, bishop f1, knight c7. So Nakamura creates a kind of fortress, but we know, at least I heard, that Carlsen doesn't believe in fortresses. So he believes that always or nearly always there is a chance to break through the fortress. g4, f5, king f3, bishop f8, bishop d3. Why Carlsen decides to give the pawn away? If bishop h6, capture on f5, capture on f5, bishop e5, attacking the knight, king, knight e8, c8, c7, king d7, bishop b5, king c8, bishop e8, winning. So he played bishop f, Nakamura plays bishop f8, bishop d3, bishop d6, g takes f, g takes f. Looks like a difficult position, but okay, how white should proceed here? How white should proceed in this situation? If white could get his bishop to g6, it would be game over. So maybe white should consider move bishop c2, then bishop b3, then bishop g8. It seems worthy, like bishop c2 maybe. Okay, bishop b1, he plays, Carlsen plays bishop b1, and there are threat of bishop a2, bishop g8, and bishop f8. Nakamura plays bishop 8, bishop f8. How now white should proceed? Okay, if obviously there are a lot of threats, but it's this position might easily be drawn, or might easily end in a draw if there is very, or even in a loss for white. There is not a lot of material. So if white plays now bishop a2, king has only one square to d6, king d6, or king e7. Okay, but king d6 is going to follow, and then bishop g7, and it's going to be it. Then, so I would recommend playing bishop a8, a2, and then bishop g7. But, okay, it wasn't played in the game. Let's see, bishop a2. I don't think that black can rescue himself from this situation. If knight d5, obviously then c, then capture on d5, king d5, c7, and white promotes. If black goes to d6, it also not an option since there is bishop a3, king a c6, bishop f8. And if black goes to e7, then this was my idea, to play bishop g7 and to get the pieces kind of stuck. Bishop g7, maybe, and now white has a threat of playing bishop g8. So if black plays knight a6, then bishop a g8 would follow. But I don't know if that's a threat. So, okay. Bishop a2. Okay, so instead of bishop e5, bishop a2, king e7, bishop g7, knight knight e8 also possible to consider, bishop e5, but it's all dangerous for black. It's all dangerous, extremely. Now there is a threat of c7, king d7, bishop e6, king d8, bishop g8, bishop h6. Oh, maybe it's not as good. Maybe it's not as good. And if capture on f8, now it's not good. So this kind of might be not be as good, since a capture on f8 is not as strong, and if white withdraw his bishop to e5, then there is a capture on h6, maybe. King d8, maybe still, well, white still has a great position. Okay, Carlsen plays bishop e5, bishop d6, and bishop d6. So Carlsen just takes on d6, king d6, bishop f5, and the pawn on h7 is going to fall, and then pawn h6 is going to march. By the way, there was maybe bishop f5, king f5, bishop d6. But also, if before, bishop c7, b3, bishop e5, and if knight e8, then c7. It's not possible. Knight d6 defends the pawn. Knight e7, bishop e5, king has to go back, and now move king e4. Well, it also seems now there is a threat f5 and then c7. If knight to d6, king d4, also very strong position, but not as straightforward as the move that was made in the game. Bishop d6, king d6, bishop f5. Okay, at this point Nakamura resigned, since Carlsen is going to capture on h7. And the pawn is going to march. By the way, I don't know if what I did is already a problem. Maybe g6, f6, king d6, an interesting position, but not so interesting, since there is king f4, king e6, and king g5, and the game is over. Okay, thank you for watching.